Hello and welcome back. This is the third section on layout, and in this section we're going to look at axes and grid lines. Now, axes are particularly important because they form the basis of the message that your chart and graph is putting over to the user. And as such, they give a way to deceive and be deceived, really. The careful, clever, deceptive use of axes can fundamentally change the way in which a graph or chart is interpreted. So it's very important to understand both how to present your own data and how to interpret data that's being presented to you. Now we're going to carry on with our sales per month spreadsheet for the moment, and the chart we've got has two axes, a vertical axis and a horizontal axis, and in fact most of the charts and graphs in Excel have two axes, but not all of them do. There are charts and graphs with three axes, and there are some, such as radar charts, which only have one. And in fact, if you take, for example, a pie chart has no axes. So we're going to look at the case of two, which is the most common one, and we'll look at some of the others as we work through the applications of graphs and charts later on. Our horizontal axis here is a time axis, and each interval is 1 month of time. If we on the Layout tab click on Axes, the drop down gives us a choice between primary horizontal and primary vertical. Let's look at primary horizontal. We see the options are none, which is easy enough to show. We can click none and we have no axes. Back then to the drop down, show a left to right axis, which is basically what we had and is basically the default. We can also have show an axis without labeling. In this case we have the axis line there, but there are no labels on it. And we can show a right to left axis. This actually shows the same data, but the data run Jan to June from right to left. Let's go back to the traditional one, the normal show left to right axis, and then I can either click on the axis, right click to get a context menu, or here I can use the drop down primary horizontal axis and say more primary horizontal axis options, and of course I get a dialog. Now the dialog is of similar style with sort of formatting options, but also specific axis options, and that's what we're going to look at next. So let's look at one or two of the options we can choose here for axis options. Let's start with this one, interval between tick marks. At the moment the tick marks that you should just be able to see on the horizontal axis here are at single units. If I were to set that to say 3, it's actually updated live as I do it, and if I close the dialog now you can see that I just have a tick mark every third month. And as I said just now, one option for bringing up that dialog, if I right click here, format axis takes me straight into that. Let me change that 3 back to 1. And label distance from axis I'm going to change next. At the moment you can see where the label is in relation to the axis. I'm going to change that from 100 to 500 just to make it quite a big change, and you can see the actual labels themselves stay where they were, but the plot area is slightly rescaled to allow for that increase in size. Let me put that back to 100 again. So there are a number of options you can experiment with there to change the look and feel, and probably make better use of the space you've got for your graph or chart. So now let's look at the vertical axis. This vertical axis is actually in dollars, and if I click on the Layout tab, Axes, Primary Vertical Axis, I have a few more options here. I still have the default axis, which is the one that's shown, and I'll have formatting. Let me quickly look at the formatting options here. Don't think they'll hold particularly many surprises in terms of things like line color, line style, shadow, etc. But interestingly, on the axis options, we have a choice here for minimum and maximum values. Now, on the vertical axis, this is really usually the main way to deceive and be deceived. If I take it for an example here, the number of dollars on this sales per month data varies over a very small scale up to just over $500 from a very small number. Now, quite often, if we're dealing with very large numbers, people will use the vertical scale to manipulate the impression of how much something has increased or decreased. And in fact, in one or two of the examples we're going to use from business applications later on, I'll show you in much more detail how this is done. But if you wanted to change the basis of vertical values here, you would do it using one of those options. Let me again go back. I'll do a right click here, format axis for the vertical axis. But apart from that, you have the same sort of things. You have major tick mark types. You can vary how frequently the marks are and so on. And you can also use logarithmic scale. Again, that's something I'll show you in an example later on. And one final point about vertical axis. I've chosen this particular example because the numbers are fairly convenient, small numbers up to about 500 or so. Very often we're dealing with very large numbers, and Excel 2010 deals with these pretty well. On the Layout tab, if you click on Axes, Primary Vertical Axis, you can actually show the axis in thousands, millions or billions, which means you haven't got to have numbers on there with loads of zeros in them. And in fact, if you go into more primary vertical axis options as before, and again look on the axis options, display units roughly in the middle here, we can have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, right up to trillions now. So if you have very large numbers to show, Excel 2010 can deal with those automatically. We're now going to look at grid lines, and on this particular chart, grid lines don't really help very much in great detail. In fact, the horizontal lines we've got for hundreds of dollars are pretty useful, particularly if we haven't got data labels or a data table underneath. We can see, for instance, here, easily read across that this value is about 360, something like that. It's actually 364. Vertical grid lines add very little for us. If we click on the Layout tab under Grid Lines and select Primary Vertical Grid Lines, the default at the moment is selected, which is none. If I put in Major Grid Lines, see what happens. We finish up with vertical lines corresponding to the months. In some of the later examples, vertical grid lines are actually going to be very helpful, but they don't really add very much here. Now let's look at horizontal grid lines on this one as an example. If I right click on the vertical axis and select Format Axis, I'm going to go back to Axis Options again, and one thing we didn't comment on before was that the major units on the vertical axis here are hundreds, which of course you can see. But minor units are also defined. Excel 2010, when it looks at the data, automatically selects both major and minor units, and it's actually set them at $20. The reason you can't see anything is apparent if you look further down this page on the Format Axis dialog, and that is that major tick mark type outside, minor tick mark type none. So the reason the 20s aren't apparent is there are no tick marks. If I put the tick marks also outside, you can now see, you should just be able to see the marks there. So let's now go back into grid lines again. primary horizontal grid lines. Currently we have major switched on. We could switch on minor, or we could switch on both. So let's switch on major and minor grid lines. Now what we can see now is both sets of grid lines, and the major ones are actually slightly heavier than the minor ones. And in fact, if you click on a grid line, right click on it, you actually have a format grid lines dialog. And depending on whether it's major or minor, you can change the line color, transparency, style, and so on. So you can make a very flexible arrangement of horizontal, major and minor grid lines. We're now going to finish off this review of the main layout options in Excel 2010 by looking at the group under background. The chart we've got here does actually have a background, and in order to demonstrate these main options I'm going to use one of them, which is the 3D rotation option. Now this is a 3D chart, and if I click on that and look at 3D rotation, it's currently got an X rotation of 110 degrees, a Y of 15. Let me just move this dialog over here and you can see what happens now. I'm going to change the Y rotation and I'm going to increase it by just a few degrees at a time, get it up to 90. And if I close that, you can see in a much better way the 3D nature of this chart. Now what you can see here are the floor and the walls. Now formatting the floor is pretty straightforward, but it is one of those where you have to get the mouse in just the right place. So roughly in the middle of the floor here, right click and I get an option, Format Floor. And I can, for instance, now say I want a solid fill and I can choose a floor color. Let me choose a color you'll be able to see but not too dark. There we are, a green color. And then on the layout tab there is a chart floor option with a drop down, which is none, that clears the chart floor fill, or show chart floor, which basically shows the chart floor, but having cleared the fill I need to go back in again now, format floor, solid fill, and it puts back in the color that I had there before. To format the walls, what I'm first going to do is to go back to grid lines, primary horizontal grid lines, and change back to just having major. And then it's easier to right click, click on Format Walls, and choose a fill for the walls. Now I think on this occasion, just to show you how this is done, I'm going to go for gradient fill, and I'm going to choose preset colors. Let's have something that's not too overwhelming, say that one, and click on close. Obviously I've got some minor settings here where I can more fully customize this selection, but if I click on close, you can now see how that gradient fill gives my chart a much better overall appearance. So having used the gradient fill in the plot area, I could, for instance, now move the legend to a slightly better position, and if I right click on the chart area, click on Format Chart Area and select Gradient Fill there as well, close that, perhaps move the title a little and the legend a little, then my chart is really beginning to look a lot better now, and I have of course a huge amount of control over how to present everything else to do with this chart. I could, for instance, clear the fill here, so that the background of the horizontal axis label becomes transparent again. I can change fonts, point sizes and so on to achieve exactly the effect that I want with my chart. So under Chart Tools, the next tab we have is Format, and if I wanted to, I could use some of the features on the Format tab to further improve the appearance of this chart. But I'm not going to do that now, because we're going to move on to looking at specific charts and graphs to deal with specific requirements. And as we do that, we'll use the features of the Format tab to deal with specific issues and specific needs. So we're going to start with that in the next section, where we're going to deal with ways of showing trends in Excel 2010. So I'll see you then.